All right, AP Human Geography classes, here's our next unit, development. And what we're going to be doing really is comparing and contrasting MDCs versus LDCs, right? More developed countries versus less developed countries through maps and data and so on and so forth. Let's get to it. Well, we're first going to focus on this. Why does development vary among countries? Well, first off, let's define what is development. So development is this. It's the improvement of material conditions of a people. All right, and how that is done is through two ways: knowledge, aka education or schools, which you're in, all right, and technology, and specifically production machines. All right, and so there's two groups of development, which I just mentioned before: MDCs versus LDCs, a more developed country versus a less developed country. All right, as you can see here to the right, a little picture of the Industrial Revolution, which has progressed many MDCs to where they are today. All right, probably the biggest indicator of development throughout the world is the Human Development Index, which is created by the UN. All right, it categorizes a country's level of development, 0 being the worst and 1.0 being the highest level of development. So the HDI is focused on three important factors, breaking down to economic, social, and demographic. Economic is focused on the gross domestic product, or GDP, which I'll define in a little bit. Social factor is focused on literacy rate and education level, which I kind of discussed. And demographic, if you notice, is focused on some alphabet soup terminology such as life expectancy, infant mortality rate, natural increase rate, and crude birth rate. Sounds familiar. Let's keep going. All right, let's focus on gross domestic product. Well, what is GDP? GDP is the value of the total output of goods and services produced in a country within 1 year. All right, so for example, Samsung is a Korean company. It produces and manufactures TVs that they sell to the United States. That would be included in GDP. There's also another factor, which is GDP per capita, and that's a fancy way in economics for saying per person, per capita per person. So what is this? Well, if you divide GDP by total population, well, this is the proposed average of a country per person, if you will. All right, and per capita, just to note, has increased greatly in MDCs over the years and not so much in LDCs, and we'll talk more about that in class. All right, let's talk about other economic indicators. Well, first, HDI looks at types of jobs as well, and we can break this down into three categories. One is primary jobs, which are mining, fishing, and farming. We have secondary jobs. You can think about some countries that are manufacturing countries. All right, and then we can think about the United States with a lot of tertiary jobs, and this is service jobs that are in law, education, retail, etc. All right, the second economic indicator is worker productivity, and this is the value of the product compared to the labor needed to make it. So, hear me out. MDCs have more machines, thus can produce more with less effort. Does not mean expensive versus inexpensive. And LDCs rely more on human and animal efforts, thus producing less. So, doesn't rely on how expensive something is to produce, it just relies on how quickly one can produce it. And last but not least is the availability of consumer goods, and this is through technology. All right, so the relative availability and reliability of, let's say, transportation and communication, two important points of technology, all right, increase overall the Human Development Index for a country. You can remember the three C's: cars, cell phones, and computers, as far as the availability of consumer goods is concerned. All right, let's talk about the second factor, social, educational literacy. This should be clear, but the higher level of development, the better education system. So the HDI focused on two factors: teacher to student ratio, which in MDCs is roughly 20 students per classroom, and LDCs is 30 plus, sometimes 40 or 50 kids per classroom. Another factor is the literacy rate, which is the percentage of the country's people that can read and write. And so in MDCs, it's 98%, which shouldn't be that surprising, but in LDCs, in today's age, which is surprising, it's less than 60% of the population able to read and write. All right, so why the discrepancy in the literacy rate? Well, MDCs publish more books and newspapers and magazines than LDCs, and unfortunately, LDCs learn information not printed in their native language, such as English, Russian, German. All right, most print is in these languages, as MDCs obviously produce these books. Other social factors of HDI. Well, one is health, and this is obviously influenced by diet. MDCs have increased levels of daily caloric intake as well as protein, and they just have more hospitals, doctors, and nurses per capita or per person. Also, welfare, which we know is the public assistance to help those who cannot work. Well, MDCs are having difficulty actually paying for welfare because the population is increasing and economic growth in the last couple of years hasn't been up to par. So we're having trouble paying for welfare, whereas LDCs doesn't even have as much welfare as MDCs. Okay, let's focus on our third factor here. Let's talk about demographics. So first off, life expectancy is a huge factor, which is increased due to health and welfare, especially in MDCs. If you look here, the average lifespan in MDCs is in the 70s, higher in different countries, obviously in others, and in LDCs it's 60s. That's a 10-year difference. Also to note, in gender-wise, females live longer than males. In MDCs, males live 10 years longer than in LDCs, and females live 13 years more in MDCs than in LDCs. If you take a look at this chart here to the right, this was as of 2012 by the CDC, where it focused on the life expectancy by gender within the United States. You can see females live to about 81 and males 76. Other demographic factors of HDI, one is IMR, or infant mortality rate. In MDCs, there's a 99.5% chance of survival. In LDCs, it's a 94% chance of survival, so a 6% death rate with infants. Now, here's why. The difference is due to malnourishment, right? An infant is up to the age of 1, all right, categorized there, and poor medical practices. Another demographic factor is natural increase rate, or NIR, which, as you remember, is a CBR minus the CDR, or the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. That's how we get NIR. In LDCs, the population is increasing by 1.5%. In MDCs, it is increasing by 0.2%. So in countries that can't even sustain its own population, already the increasing birth rate is even more damaging on the economy and on social life. And last but not least, we focus on the crude birth rate, or the CBR, and there's obviously higher birth rates in LDCs. If you look at the numbers here, there's 23 per 1,000 births in LDCs and 12 per 1,000 in MDCs. Now the difference is MDCs have easy access to birth control methods versus LDCs. Okay, that was it. We're going to focus much more on these in class. All right, I'll see you then.